Last part of the panel this morning, Richard Gomer has been working in the area of understanding the sort of question around that we hear a lot, that, oh, there's this conflict between what users say is important to them in terms of privacy and then what they do online. And a simple hypothesis that suggests maybe we do online what our tools let us do easily in the time and balance off what's more important to us at that moment. How might we address that if this is an interaction problem, not a desire problem? So Richard.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the work, and it's a series of studies that I've done around how we explain things to users and how this influences consent and ideas around that. So essentially, it's not the cookie, stupid. And obviously that's not a cookie, that's an iceberg.
Well done.
Yeah.
Well done.
So we'll come back to the iceberg, and I hope it will be clear why it's not the cookie by the end of the talk.
It's clear now, Richard, that that's not a cookie.
In a more general sense. So I thought I'd start with some computer science theory, because I think that's always a good place to start. So for the non-computer scientists in the room, this is the theoretical model of how the internet works. So we have this four-layer model, link internet transport application, and basically this is electrons, packets, pipes, and Snapchat. So you know, the link layer, this is your satellite link, the cable. You've got packets that we can send around the internet. We've got this idea of a pipe, that you can set up a connection between two computers. And then on top of that, we've got some application. And the whole point of this model is that an application developer, the Snapchat developer, the web developer, doesn't need to care about the things that come below. We don't need to know how to set up a connection, how to get a message from the UK to America. Someone else in some other layer can take care of that for us. But obviously this is a woefully inadequate model of the world. It's a fine model of the internet, but it limits your view of what's really going on. In reality, it's glue between physics and people. And it's the people that really matter. So we can talk about the application, but that's not the be-all and end-all. Snapchat does not exist as the pinnacle of creation. It serves a purpose, and really that purpose is some kind of meaningful human interaction. It could be some kind of meaningful business process. Essentially, it's usually about some kind of value fulfillment for somebody. And so that brings us rather abruptly to some law as well. So we've talked about this several times.
Okay.
The e-privacy directive from the EU introduced a new requirement for consent around cookies, in inverted commas, because it doesn't mention cookies. And it says, member states shall ensure that the storing of information or the gaining of access to information already stored in the terminal equipment of a subscriber or user is only allowed on the condition that the subscriber or user concerned has given his or her consent, having been provided with clear and comprehensive information. So it doesn't mention cookies, it's actually really general. And so there's a whole story here about how this came to be called the cookie law that I won't go into. But this is a general principle, and the implementation has varied across member states, as it typically does, but in the UK, this has given rise to these notices, which are everywhere. This is from ASOS, online fashion retailer. It says, ASOS uses cookies to ensure that we give you the best experience on our website. If you continue, we assume that you consent to receive all cookies on all ASOS websites. And there's a link that says more info. And so I clicked the more info link, not in my course of using ASOS, but because for this talk I thought it might be interesting. And we find that the clear and comprehensive information that ASOS have provided about cookies for their users is in fact a fairly in-depth taxonomy of the different types of cookies that exist, and in fact nothing about the cookies that ASOS themselves are actually using. Which is kind of a pathological outcome, in that every website will now tell you all about cookies. There are these encyclopedic references about what a cookie is and what it can be used for. and really next to no information about what this website is actually doing. And so we've become stuck, in effect, at some layer below people. We've become stuck at some technological abstraction where these websites will tell you in great detail what they're doing technically, how they've implemented their website, and really nothing about the intent, nothing about the meaningful business interaction or the human interaction that they're trying to achieve. So that brings me to the first piece of research that I've done. So this was a survey of all the different cookie consent messages I could find in the wild. So this was semi-automated. What I did, I built a browser tool that effectively I would go on a website and then I would pick the cookie notice that popped up. It would take a screenshot of that, save a list of the cookies, and save an HTML snippet. So that was automated, but the actual picking of the banner itself was done by a human. Then I did some, I call it visual thematic analysis on these pictures to work out, what do these cookie consent notices look like? What are the themes? What are the trends in these? And I did this across the Alexa top 100 UK sites, and then I got a random sample of .co.uk from Nominet, which is the .uk registrar. I think they're the second largest national registrar in the world. So the results from this are sort of interesting. Here's a selection of the different notices that you get. So we get things like some websites up in the top left, that's the Telegraph. They just have a little link at the top saying privacy and cookies. Although apparently if we paid them enough, they would put whatever we liked. We've got ASOS in there, who have their little banner. Gov.uk is interesting. Gov.uk uses cookies to make the site simpler, apparently. HMRC just has a little link. They're the UK tax man. The Mirror, a national newspaper, has a how we use cookies link. And so, what are the trends among these notices? Well, there are three kinds of notice that websites in the UK are using, with a few notable exceptions that didn't turn up in this sample. The first is this idea of just linking to your policy. So that's the approach taken by the Telegraph in the top left, and whatever company is in the bottom right. So you just put a link to your cookie policy, like you do with your privacy policy, and all your users will probably view that just after they've read your terms and conditions. The second is this ultimatum. The idea that the website tells you, we use cookies, and by using the website, you consent to that. So you can like it or lump it, basically. And the third is an ultimatum plus a justification. So we use cookies. By browsing our website, you accept that we use cookies, and they're for your own good. They make your experience simpler. They improve the user experience. And they break down like this. I also looked at where they appear on the page. Typically, they appear at the top or somewhere in the bottom. That ASOS notice that appears sort of over the page is quite rare. So, armed with this knowledge of how useless all the consent messages are, we put them to a focus group. And we said to the focus group, what do you understand by these messages? What does it mean when this website says to improve your experience? And quite predictably, nobody knew what it meant when the website said to improve your experience, to make the website easier to use. Moreover, even when we said to them, this is what you could do with a cookie, there was really very little understanding of what that meant to them personally. We could explain the technical details of a cookie, and your average user has really very little understanding or ability to infer what that means for their own data, for their own privacy, for their own experience or interaction on the web. And furthermore, the participants are largely unaware of the types of data held by the companies they're interacting with. So we said to them, DoubleClick is a company that collects data about users somehow. What do you think they've got? And they said, oh, they've probably got my email address, because maybe they asked Amazon for it. And maybe they've got my postcode, because I typed that into a form. And none of them really say, Oh, they know what I'm interested in because they're watching my web browsing. And we can speculate why this is, because a cookie is an application layer concept. It's a thing below the things people care about. It's not in the people layer of this whole interaction. So what people care about is their identity, how the world sees them, how they interact with other people. And cookies are an implementation detail. It would be almost like a website saying, we'd like permission to send you some electrons. It's meaningless, really, in terms of what you care about. So this brings me back to the iceberg. And cookies are a bit like an iceberg in that you can see a bit on the surface, and we're told the cookie's there. We can see this bit bobbing along. But there's all this other stuff we care about. Like the bit that's going to sink your ship it's the purpose of the cookie. Why are you collecting this data? Is it for analytics? Is it to profile me? Is it to improve your website? Will it affect me if I turn it off? There are side effects, potentially, on my identity, on my privacy. If you're profiling me, that can affect how you interact with me, how advertisers interact with me. And there are risks. Even if you keep to the side of the bargain you've said you will, that you'll only use the data in the way you've said you'll use it, there is still a risk if that data is breached, if someone else uses that data in a different way, or if my context collapses. You know, if you show an advert to me while my mother stood behind me and she makes some inference from that. So that brings me to the study that I'm working on at the moment. We wanted to test out the effects of using different narratives to explain behavioral profiling to people, so that we can move beyond double-click is using a cookie and say, what is double-click doing in different terms, moving up the stack to these more human concepts. So you can compare this to things like Mozilla Lightbeam or Ghostery, in that we built a browser add-on for Google Chrome that collects this data and then tries to show it back to people. And this was not a predictive thing. This wasn't a notice and consent type interaction. This was reflecting on what had already happened. But there are still lessons here for consent, especially if we're talking about consent as an ongoing process. So effectively, we store a referrer network of every URL you visited and the third parties that were involved. We also keep a complete log of everything that's happened to a cookie on your computer. What this allows us to infer is for any point in time, the cookies that were active on your computer, and to reverse engineer from that the profiles that each of these third parties could have built about you based on the websites that they've observed you visit. And then we feed this back in a few different ways. So we've got 4 of these different notices, and this is almost our control. It says some domain has placed one possible tracking cookie on your computer, and the user has 2 options in this study. They can dismiss this notice, or they can safely remove this information from dendex.net, which in fact just deletes the cookie that links this particular user to that collected profile. The second notice type I wanted to investigate was this idea that some tracker has observed a certain percentage of your web browsing history. This is quite an intuitive way to explain to someone. They have an idea of what browsing history is, and they don't like the idea that someone else knows. Browsing history is considered to be a private thing between you and your computer. So when you tell someone that bluekai.com has observed 31% of their browsing history in the past 48 hours, that does typically get a response. Again, they can dismiss that notice and do nothing. They can safely remove that information by deleting the tracking cookie that links them to it. The third one we tried was, well, these are quite statistical. They require some sort of numeracy. What if we just show a list of a few different pages that some websites seen you visit? So QuantServe has observed your visits to The Guardian, The Telegraph, the Conservative Party Conference 2014 Live, and 5 other web pages. Again, you can dismiss this notice. You can safely remove the information by deleting the tracking cookie that links you to it. And then finally thought, well, in terms of identity, these are kind of interesting, but what does this mean in terms of behavioral profiling? Well, what do these domains think about me based on this? And this is, to some extent, this anthropomorphizes the surface, and some people will say, well, it's just a computer, you shouldn't pretend it's a human. On the other hand, these are organizations of people, so why should we pretend it's just a computer? I think you could argue either way. And again, so we say something like stackoverflow.com thinks you're interested in JavaScript, Ajax, computer programming, and software engineering, because at the time I was building this plugin. And again, you can dismiss this notice to safely remove this information. So we trialed this with 20-something users who completed the study. And every time they opened a new tab, they were shown one of these messages. And the results are interesting. So we get different removal rates for the different types of notice. Cookie was the most effective with this group, and we have a selection bias in the people who took part. We have selected here people who have privacy concerns, who are typically reasonably well educated about these issues, and who have some concern about cookies. In a moment, I'll break it down by participant. And we see that the second most effective in terms of getting user action, in terms of deleting this information, was when we said to people, this is what this domain thinks you're interested in, the topic list. That gets people to delete their information in about 28% of cases, followed by a list of pages, followed by the percentage. So the raw stats seem to be less engaging for people. But it varies by participants. This is a radar chart. So a lot of users are affected by cookies up the top. The percentage notice is effective with some people, less effective with others. So this blue person in the middle, affected more by the percent notice and the cookie count, less by these things. And so what are the implications for consent from this? Well, consent in the wild is far from meaningful. The consent messages that we observe on the web today are shallow. They are couched in an abstraction that doesn't mean anything to people, and that doesn't allow them to make a link between what they're being told and the things they actually care about, their own values and preferences. But the narrative that we use to explain these things does affect user action. And there is a point in there that you can educate people that cookies are bad, that they might want to delete them, and then tell them that they're in these number of cookies, but that it varies between people. And ideally, we just put it in more intuitive terms to begin with. And that effectively, using the cookie as the dominant narrative around all this discourse around the e-privacy actually obscures the user's real concerns. It obscures the intent of policymakers, and that we probably need to move on because it is not the cookie stupid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. We have 10 minutes for our panel discussion. Pending